Ray Arnaudo. Please join me, Ray. This is a consummate diplomat, a man who's been involved in many of the things about which you've heard today, largely because for a long time he had a polar responsibility, which meant he worked with Antarctica. Come on up here, Ray. And he led many of us as we went through the task of building these new organizations. She's also been in the diplomatic corps in Russia and elsewhere. So he brings that host of experience to kind of integrate the diplomatic side of this discussion. Ray, it's all yours.
Thanks, Bob. I'm just as I'm listening to these discussions, I sort of marvel at the fact, Bob, that it was about 25 years ago that this whole process started, which is a long time. I was only 12 when I took the lead, but Bob and I go way back, and I'm going to just make one sort of major point about the importance of science in Arctic cooperation, which is sort of what this conference is about. And then I'm going to pose a couple of questions to each that I've come up with listening to what you had to say. Julie, I will not say anything embarrassing about U.S. foreign policy or anything. But I would note, I mean, the beginnings of the cooperative effort came from an agreement among the Arctic scientists that there wasn't enough coordination. Primarily the Russians weren't playing. And it started with it was a Canadian, Norwegian, Danish, Jürgen Tagholt and Fred Roots and Odd Rogney. We used to call it the Odd Fred proposal. But they came up with this idea about we need more cooperation between Arctic scientists. There wasn't one. That led to AAAS, the first Arctic International Coordination Group. That was International Arctic Science Committee. Bob had a big role in that. He would be off negotiating with the leadership of the Science Foundation behind him. He'd come back to the State Department. We'd say, no, Bob, that's not going to work. Try again. But it got it right. It all worked. It all came out. And that led to this meeting of scientists which set up these different goals about what was missing in Arctic science cooperation. And there were 4 working groups. Those later turned into the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy. Those working groups are still there as the basis for the Arctic Council and what they do. So the point being science at the foundations of Arctic cooperation. Followed, again, Bob was involved in this. He led the science initiative to get an assessment of Arctic climate change and got money from the U.S. to do it. It was one of the first major efforts that the Arctic Council did. He did it just in time for a new administration to come into Washington to say, we don't believe in anything you've discovered, but the facts were there, couldn't be avoided, and a lot of progress was made. Last point on this, I'd say, is that it did have this wonderful impact of bringing Russia into the whole process, which was part of it. I'll ask a question or two about how well it's worked, but I think it's important to note that's one of the things that happened under this. And the final point is that on the importance of bringing the native communities and indigenous peoples into this. We talk a little about the permanent participants, which Paula mentioned in the Arctic Council structure. I strongly note the importance of bringing traditional knowledge, and I have a couple of questions about that, into this science-based organization. Extremely important and successful, I think. I believe the Arctic Council remains one of the few forums that actually have institutionalized the role of indigenous groups in information. And that is large, especially large if you're a native, where science, basically, as they say, scientists come up, they take notes, then they disappear and write their papers, and we have no idea what they've been talking about. I think the Arctic Council has been important in changing that. So let me just ask a couple of questions. I know there'll be some from the audience, but I'm going to pose them to the people who've spoken, and maybe that'll guide the discussion a bit. But Mark, I mean, main question I'd ask you is if you have the time to explain a little bit better about how the funding process, emphasis on science perhaps, is handled by the federal government, because there is no Department of the Arctic in the U.S. that manages this, and it's always been ad hoc. I had this question myself when I was in the role of coordinating State Department's approach, but how's that handled? Secondly, you mentioned icebreaker. I'd just like you to ask, if you could describe a little bit about why our icebreaker fleet hasn't been kept up, but secondly, is it going to work this time? And are we going to get an icebreaker or two, maybe? Huh? And let's leave it at that for now. I think that's enough. Paula, main question I asked you, speaking for the Finns, is what's going to happen when Finland takes over from the U.S.? And is there some discussion about the coordination between what kind of issues has the U.S. been talking about, and how's Finland going to take that handoff? Julie, you could comment on that too. And stressing the importance of native knowledge. I know you did mention the Sami quite a bit, but maybe if you could elaborate a bit on how that input, that of the Sami people, comes into the decision making and the science decisions that are made in Finland. Julie, I'd ask really a softball question, but you might explain how the U.S. and Alaska, which as we all know is an independent entity of itself, but how you coordinate and how you work the science. We could get John to help out on that perhaps, but if you want to speak to the traditional knowledge one, that'd be helpful too. But and then Charlie, for you, I have the obvious question. I mean, you've talked about this grand scheme of a research development plan, but my fundamental question remains, how do you propose to coordinate the science inputs from these 8 disparate countries, which kind of refuse to be coordinated? They all do their work, but every time there's meetings, it's stressed here, this is a bottoms-up organization. Everyone has their own plans, research plans. There is no centralized authority. How you're going to make that work, that'd be good to know. And lastly, back to my traditional knowledge. No, I am not a Native American Alaskan. I'm not, but I do worry about the input of the indigenous community in your planning for what IASA plans to do and how you're going to get those folks' views in there.
Ray, thank you very much. As you know, he always ends up giving the work back to the rest of us. Ray, there's a chair right here for you.